Hey everyone, welcome to Gaming Injustice. Today's subject, the Metroid Prime series. I'll mainly be focusing on the Trilogy collection, which is available on the Wii and Wii U, while showing the changes made in each entry and making some comparisons to the first Metroid Prime on the GameCube. My last review was a series of 6 videos about 2 games that wound up being about 4 hours long. Here, I'm going to look at 2 editions of 3 games in an hour or so. Yeah, figure that one out. And I know what you're thinking, but Nick, your shtick is standing up for games that other people don't appreciate or know about. What makes you think Metroid Prime needs your help? Metroid Prime is like super popular. Everyone loves it. Look at all these other reviews. Yeah, there's a little more to it than you might think. There are circles of people who hate these games for pretty silly reasons, and if anything, would have you believe that the Prime games came closest to killing Metroid, like the essence of the Metroid series. And Other M, with its old school visuals and reused enemies, saved the series, bringing it back to what it's supposed to be, laser Cheerios and all, even though it didn't do much to help the series financially. So believe me, this game does warrant some defending. First, I want to take a minute to talk about Canonicity. Now, I'm not here to start some big flame war in the comments over what's canon and what isn't. I know some people can't get into Metroid as a series because they find the games dreadful and boring and lifeless and don't latch onto Samus the way people like me do, with Other M being the only game they actually enjoyed and the only time they cared about Samus. I do not understand these people. But if you are one of those people, maybe I can help you understand weirdos like me who somehow do enjoy apparently soulless and terrible games. The whole canon thing is just confusing anyway. For the uninitiated, when something is canon, that just means it happened, and if something conflicts with an established canon so much that it creates a plot hole, or if it gets retconned and removed from the timeline by something else, that makes it non-canon. It doesn't always go that way though, sometimes with one canon being the real one, and the others being variants. Transformers has been remade so many times that it has several fleshed out canons, but the Japanese canon of the series like G1 is a little different than it is in America thanks to series like the Headmasters. The Star Wars Expanded Universe was canon, now only some parts of it are, the rest of it basically relegated to fanfiction status. Most of the elements that were carried over to the new canon are things that occurred before the original trilogy, that won't get in the way of whatever Disney wants to do with the new movies. But even then, we're seeing characters like Thrawn return in new roles that'll fit the new timeline. Not to mention tons of stuff from the Old Republic era, and even a few set pieces that seem to harken back to the Dawn of the Jedi series creeping in. Darth Revan almost appeared in a cancelled episode of the Clone Wars a few years back, with a model made for him and everything. Until the day some Disney executive and his goons bust my door open and order me to stop playing Knights of the Old Republic, it shouldn't matter what people say is canon or not. Up until Other M was released, the Prime games were considered part of the Metroid canon, all taking place between the original Metroid and Metroid 2 Return of Samus. However, once Other M was released, all that suddenly became a lot more nebulous. Japanese developers apparently don't like Retro's vision of the Metroid universe. They thought it was too Western or sullen, and just didn't like that this is the version of Metroid that exploded and became so popular for a few years. Some say it's just a translation error in a cutscene or a slip-up from some crappy old interview that even made things this way. But Other M's story makes it almost impossible for the Prime games to take place in the same timeline. Samus' flashback scenes don't really leave any room for it. I'm pretty sure this was done by accident though, and the writers, chiefly Sakamoto, didn't maliciously set out to erase the Prime games. It just sorta happened. This is one of many things that makes the recently released AM2R so fascinating to me. If you want to play all the Metroid games in chronological order, and you start with Zero Mission, then play the Prime games, then jump into Metroid 2 Return of Samus, the next game on the timeline, the change is pretty jarring to say the least. In fact, the whole feel of Metroid 2 just doesn't feel that compatible with the Prime games. I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way, that jumping into Metroid 2 after finishing Prime 3 feels like something just doesn't match up, you know? This is one of the things that's so great about AM2R, is how it tries to squeeze the Prime games back into the timeline. There are so many touches in this game, from the music to the sound effects. The the architecture to the log entries, to even the presence of a Galactic Federation ship that looks like the one seen in Prime 2, and bodies of Federation soldiers wearing both the blocky white armor from the Prime games and the blue armor see another M, like the new outfits have only just started being made around this time, and even just the fact that walls and objects that can be destroyed by super missiles are made of a substance called cordite, just like in the Prime games. All of this stuff makes it so easy to jump into this game right after you finish the Prime series, to go into this next chapter of the story and think, yeah, this works. It also has a lot of similar homages and references to fusion, including the natural original forms of creatures like Ceres and Genesis, which were copied by the X-Parasites in that game, but we never saw what they originally looked like, aside from Ceres' skeleton. It's so respectfully done, and yet it somehow almost makes Other M feel like the one that doesn't belong, without even trying to, just by making these games look so much more authentic. Now, this whole is it canon, is it not sort of thing really shouldn't be an issue. People should be able to enjoy whichever canon they want, and that's where the conversation should end. Unfortunately, a lot of fans of any given series with some elements of questionable canonicity do adopt the attitude that if something isn't explicitly canon, well then it isn't important, and you should stop talking about it like it's anything worth a damn because it isn't. Just forget it ever happened because it did, and you should feel bad for bringing it up at all. So shut up, stupid! I'm sure some of you have run into people like this, these obnoxious phoebes who strongly believe that it is not okay to enjoy something that isn't stated to be 100% canon, anything that doesn't fall perfectly in line with the original creator's vision, even if it ends up being superior to that vision. They will not let you have that in any capacity. They will not allow you to pollute their precious canon. They will fight for the purity of the one true vision until the precious senpai tells them to back off. And the Prime series is one of the biggest victims of this harmful mentality that I've seen. You could bring up all sorts of great points, explain to people in detail why you enjoy the Prime games, and no matter what you say, they'll shoot it down and dismiss you by saying, it's not canon, so who cares what you think? Why can't you just stop being an asshole and let these games die for the integrity of the Metroid series? This surprisingly widespread practice of demeaning people for clinging to the wrong canon is despicable to me. In terms of world building and atmosphere, the Metroid Prime games add so much more worthwhile material to the Metroid lore, and even Samus as a character in some ways, than Other M ever does, and I'll go into detail about that as we jump into these games. I just want to be clear that I don't hate Other M, I'm just solely disappointed that this is Sakamoto's vision for how the Metroid series should be, and that so many fans have fallen for its nostalgic visuals, this lovingly crafted illusion of it being more faithful to the old school Metroid games than the Prime games, because it has laser Cheerios. So if the last 5 minutes haven't bored you enough to make you close this tab, let's jump into Metroid Prime. First, I want to talk about something that's very important to me when it comes to any Metroid game: the worlds. The Prime games have some very cool worlds. Talon IV is one of the most well-developed and depressing worlds I have ever seen in a game. It's a long while before you even see a Metroid in 3D for the first time, and while they're kind of easy to defeat, just seeing one blew my mind and made me ready for anything. And there is so much more to this world than that. Since being hit by a meteor decades ago, the planet has been slowly corrupted by a cancerous blue sludge called Phazon. This world is so far gone by the time you set foot on it, many of the animals you meet are in their last few generations, if not the last generation of their species, with only 25 years remaining before the planet becomes a total wasteland where nothing but the most horrendously mutated abominations could possibly hope to survive. Think the great dying on our planet was bad? We're witnessing the most brutal years of a mass extinction event right now. In the first moments of the game, it should be pretty obvious even from space that this is not a nice place to settle down, but when you explore the surface, you see that, for a time, it may well have been. It's just on its way out now. Talon IV was a Chozo colony, similar to Zebes, where a tribe of aging Chozo chose to settle down and spend the last remaining years in peace, communing with the planet's nature and ascending to higher planes of consciousness and all that good stuff. The Chozo were already a cool race before this game was released, but Retro Studios is responsible for adding a lot of mystique and history to this previously underdeveloped race that Nintendo has been content to just forget about as of late. I mean, sure, the manga helped, but as for their portrayal in the games, it doesn't get better than this. They're like the mystics from the Dark Crystal. In fact, I can't watch that movie now without being reminded of the Chozo by the Skeksis, like those are what evil, corrupt Chozo would look like. When you get there, you find out that the Chozo ruins have already been abandoned for decades, long before Zebes was taken over by Mother Brain, now overrun by horribly mutated flora and fauna. What's really interesting about these Chozo is they were able to see the future. Kind of. They knew a disaster was coming and chose to face it head-on, containing the coming corruption as best as they could, placing their faith in a savior they saw in their future visions who would finish their great work, a hero they simply call the Hatchling. Can you guess who it is? Yeah, it's Samus. So just by coming here and doing what Samus normally does, you're fulfilling one of the Chozo's last prophecies. That's cool. And with no living Chozo present to tell you about any of this, the story is communicated to the player through lore written all over the Chozo ruins, and you read it by scanning it. Now we get into something that makes the Metroid Prime games unique and opens so many new options for the player, the scanning visor. The scan visor is one of the most useful tools in the game. You can do all sorts of things with it. Say you're about to round a corner with turrets ready to fire at you, and you notice a terminal on the wall. If the turrets haven't already spotted you, scanning the terminal will allow Samus to hack into it and deactivate the turrets entirely, making them harmless. You can also scan fissures in the walls to see if they're breakable and what their mineral composition is so you know which weapon to destroy them with. You can also scan enemies and bosses to find weak points, learn about their origins, their life cycle, their biology, their behavior, all sorts of things. And then there's the lore. You can scan Chozo lore to learn more about things from their perspective, weaving together an epic tale in its own right. But you can also scan space pirate computers to hack into their database. Some of the pirate logs are like memos or shopping lists, they're not that relevant. The most important entries are highlighted by red, making them stand out. So consider these the abridged version of the game's story. Now, this is where things get a little weird. When the first Prime game was released on the GameCube, the titular Metroid Prime itself was implied to be a creature that the space pirates, and maybe even the Chozo, had encounters with in person. The pirates managed to remove it from its lair, the impact crater, and for a time studied and performed various experiments on it, until it escaped and made it back to the crater, now armed with pirate weaponry that was integrated into its body, making it even stronger than it was before. You can see it called by name, designated Metroid Prime by the pirates in their notes, as in the strongest Metroid to ever live, something outside and above the typical life cycle we see in Metroid 2. And they really build this creature up as a 1 in a million kind of threat. So are the Chozo, who refer to it in their lore as the Worm, like it's an evil poison-belching dragon or something. Unfortunately, this creates a bit of a plot hole, since the entire goal of the pirates and Samus is to find 12 artifacts that will open the Chozo seal over the impact crater and allow them to break into it. But if they didn't have those already, how did the pirates ever manage to retrieve Metroid Prime in the first place? I never really paid this much mind at first, but then I played the Trilogy version, and this is where things got really weird. Because of new implications made by the third game, even including the corpse of an identical, expired Metroid Prime on planet Phaze, zillions of light years away, some changes were made to the lore of the first game. You barely see the Chozo or pirates make any reference to the creature anymore, removing a lot of the presence it had and making it feel less developed. She's almost completely retconned, going back to that whole canon thing. When I played the Trilogy version, I was confused that I couldn't find any of the old references to the creature anywhere, now that the lore had been changed, and I thought, am I crazy? Was I just imagining that I read about all this stuff in the GameCube version? I understand why they had to make some changes, and probably didn't see the series going the way it did when they made the first game, but it was really disorienting for me at the time, and I do feel the game has lost a little bit of the charm it had before. Take this room for example. Before, they really built Samus up as the hatchling and all that, their chosen one. The Chozo wonder if the girl they see in their visions will come to Talon IV after all. They ask questions like, does she long for her parents, and does she still live? That last bit gives me chills. Thinking about the Chozo who etched this on these walls and couldn't be certain that the girl they were referring to would read this long after they died creates a weird feeling in my stomach. I can't explain it better than that. In the Trilogy version, they replaced this with some vague mystic babble about the temple and the MacGuffins because I guess we didn't have enough of that already. Now they just call Samus the Entrusted One. Wow, how riveting. It feels a lot more distant and impersonal. It shouldn't surprise anyone that I actually prefer the old text. It's more effective at conveying whatever was intended to be conveyed at the time. Oh well. It's still a cool story in the Trilogy version. What I really like about the scan visor is how much choice it gives the player. Anything you're having trouble with, just use the scan visor to figure it out. Want to learn more about the world's history and the pirates' activities? Use the scan visor. Want to deactivate a force field and sick a bunch of Metroids on the pirates? Use the scan visor. There is so little that you actually need to use a scan visor for, and it's usually for little things, like activating an elevator the first time you use it. Oh, boo-hoo, what a hassle. Most of this stuff is just information that's there if you want to read up on it, but none of it gets forced on you in long, intrusive cutscenes or whatever. And you know how a lot of games will force you to sit through the same boring dialogue and text and tutorial faff every time you play it? The kind of stuff that's really handy and informative the first time you play, but becomes a huge slog in every run after that, and you just wish you could skip through it all? This game has none of that. At least the first one doesn't. All the information you get by scanning stuff is completely optional, and if you already know this stuff, you can just ignore it in subsequent runs and get going. Thank you! And most of the cutscenes are really short, like a nice establishing shot or two of a new area to let you soak it in or Samus's reaction to a scary new enemy. Some people like to exaggerate the scan visor's importance, saying they couldn't get into the game because having to constantly scan everything is so boring. But these people are lying through their teeth. The scan visor is there to help you, but only if you need it or want that help. And I guess these people want everything to be so super obvious that they'll never need to be reliant on the scan visor for anything, and then they get mad when they do need it. And if you don't, just use it the 3 or 4 times you actually need it and get going. I have never seen a game from another series be this accommodating to players, and it addresses so many criticisms I've seen brought up in recent years by people like Aaron Hansen. How aggressively games spoon-feed stuff to you instead of letting you learn about it at your leisure. Well, not this game. And there are so many neat little things that foreshadow stuff to come, like in the Talon overworld, the first area you see on the planet, and even on the pirate ship at the start. On the ship, you'll find containers carrying something strange, and creatures that have gone through terrible mutations after being exposed to this stuff. Then you touch down the Talon overworld, which isn't as badly affected as other areas yet, and you'll see this weird blue fungi growing in places that have trace amounts of radiation that Samus doesn't have enough data to identify at the time. And then another part of the level, you'll find one of the pirates' containers at the crash site, which fell out of the ship, depending on how early you come here. You can even touch the stuff and be injured by it, and this is the stuff that would become so important throughout the 3 games as we see more and more of it. Another thing I like is every room in these games has a name. The Hall of this, or the Fountain of that. It makes the world feel even more developed. There's only a couple of things that still kinda bug me, like this cutscene that was changed in the Trilogy version. The original shows her convulsing, like she's going through this awesome, overwhelming transformation that no other lesser human would be able to survive, and then a completely unnecessary but totally cool pose just for the heck of it. In the new version, she just rises up, completely unfazed. Come on, we don't need that. I love the little moments like these peppered throughout the 3 games that give her some semblance of a character. But other people like to ignore this stuff. It kinda pisses me off. I also would have liked to see this fully developed adult Sheegoth that was removed from the game. I think Kraid would have made a great boss for Magmoor Caverns, the only place that doesn't have any bosses. When you beat the game, destroying Metroid Prime is implied to cause a chain reaction that destroys the toxic goo all over the planet, effectively curing it of this cancer. So even as the local wildlife is in its last days, you may have given some of them a chance to repopulate, given enough time. I love how simple this ending is, as Samus overlooks the ruins left by her adopted family, probably wondering how far and wide she'll have to look to be reunited with any survivors that may still exist, and how many dead or abandoned worlds she'll inherit before meeting a living Chozo face to face. Interestingly, if you have Metroid Fusion, you can use it to change Samus' skin and make her wear the fusion suit in the GameCube version of Metroid Prime. So if you really want to, you can kinda sorta pretend that this game takes place after Fusion, I suppose. We never got a game that does, and I think a somber ending like this would be pretty fitting for the series. It's so isolating, so haunting, like Samus has nothing left, but she's gonna keep looking until she finds something worth clinging to. Now, I'm not going to spend nearly as much time talking about the next 2 games' setting and lore. I just want to drive home how interesting the first game is, and these 2 are interesting in their own right. I love Planet Aether and the Luminoth culture in Metroid Prime 2. Their architecture, their history. It's also very interesting, and kudos to Retro for creating a completely distinct new race that feels just as developed as a Chozo did in the previous game. They just have a knack for this sort of thing. Another thing that's nice about the Luminoth? They're still around. A few of them anyway. So now you really have something to fight for, and you want to save this race from ending up just like the Chozo did. Samus, again, has some nice moments in this game that speak well of her character, like when she pays her respect to this dead Galactic Federation soldier with a simple but very humane gesture of closing his eyes, or when she's channeling the light of Aether through her body and you see how tired she is, or when she leaves at the end of the game with a simple wave like, "We cool guys."
This is the one Metroid game where I feel Samus really is up against some of her greatest fears and insecurities. The game starts off with her ship being disabled, stranding her on a planet that is essentially out to get her. The atmosphere of dark Aether burns her armor, the Ing have eradicated the military soldiers and rule more than half the planet, and a darker, more powerful Samus is out to get her. And when first confronted with all of this, she gives up, as Dark Samus breaks the light crystal protecting her, and the Ing begin their slow approach. Rising her arm cannon in the air, you can almost hear her silently screaming as she shoots upward in a vain attempt to call for help. It is only through luck that she falls back into light Aether, granting her sanctuary and the ability to try again. You can say that I might be reading into this a bit too much, but I really don't think so, for the game continues on, and in almost each cutscene, Samus can be seen as having expressions of worry, doubt, and fear. Even at the very end of the game, she is completely and utterly disgusted at the appearance of Dark Samus. And how does it all end? Well, with all of Dark Aether collapsing around her, and the Ing blocking her only exit. But even when faced with all these insurmountable odds, she is still able to pull herself together, overcome her fears, and make one final dash for that exit. And it is through these trials that she becomes a stronger person with more confidence, as can be seen by her final farewell wave to the people of Aether who applaud her exit. She even takes one final look back, proud of her accomplishments, and finally at peace with the mission's end. It is really a great story depicting wonderful and strong character development of a silent protagonist just through her reactions to the trials that she had to face when dealing with all the evils of Dark Aether. And this was all to save another man's planet. I mean, her ship was in self-repair for most of the game. She could have just waited around and then left. But no, she helped out Umos, the last of the Luminoth, and did it for free too, I might add. This is sort of contrary to what the generic image of a bounty hunter is, and in my opinion, helping someone save their home planet for free and putting your own life at risk really is the furthest thing from some sort of an ice queen. I mean, in your video you asked where we came up with the idea of Samus as a strong and independent woman, and that it wasn't from the games. But guess what? I have news for you. Yes, it was. This is how she is depicted in them, and it's not only in Metroid Fusion and Prime 2, but in all of her other titles as well.
And then there's the way she carries herself around Dark Samus. Just look at the tension between these two. It's like something out of a movie. Heck, since it's a save room right before your first battle with Dark Samus, I'm one of those guys who will reset the game a couple times just so I can relive this super fun fight before moving on. Oh, and on another note, I think it's awesome that Dark Samus is really just the brain of Metroid Prime merged with Samus' old Phazon suit. This means Metroid Prime herself is indeed the ultimate villain of all three games. The title character of the entire Metroid Prime trilogy is a Metroid. Go figure. Also, there is so much lore in this game, and it is even more fun to read than Prime 1's lore. First, you got the GF Trooper logs, where they refer to other members by name, whose logs you can also pick up, so you get a feel of the squad's group dynamic, and you get a timeline of their hardships and how things got so bad for them. And there's even one that reveals that because these games take place so early in the Metroid timeline, there are still some people, even within the Federation, who don't believe in Samus, or at least think the tales of her exploits are grossly exaggerated, comparing her to Bigfoot or Santa Claus. By the time we get to Prime 3 though, everyone knows who Samus is, probably because Illuminoth put in a good word for her as they join the Federation. Then there's the pirates, who at first mistake Dark Samus for you, and then totally panic and lose their shit once you touch down and they realize there are two Samuses attacking them now. Some of these logs are just funny, warning other pirates not to feed Metroids or try to make pets out of them. Sometimes, pirates will straight up diss other pirates behind their back for giving them a hard time. Then there's the Luminoth lore, which gives you an idea of how nice places like Torvus Block used to be until the game's new villains, the Ying, took over. Sometimes you'll even find a body with a message the person recorded in their final moments. Then there's a planet's dark side. Dark Aether is hell. The planet has a toxic atmosphere, the sky is alien as can be, and some of the creatures don't even move, they just grow in one spot and alter the environment to be nicer for other members of the species. It's probably the single most dangerous place in any Metroid game. What's really creepy about Dark Aether is how fragmented it is. The map of Dark Aether is very different next to Light Aether. The layout is generally the same, but a lot of areas are changed or outright missing, making it feel more like an unstable collection of floating islands or neighboring pocket dimensions within some Lovecraftian membrane rather than an entire world. It's kinda like the final areas of Half-Life. One touch I really like is as you retake the power Dark Aether stole from Light Aether, you can look up at the temple in the center of either world's map and you'll see Dark Aether losing its power as Light Aether regains its. Samus goes through a lot to save this world. She didn't even need to, not for herself anyway. Her ship was damaged, yeah, but it was already going to repair itself, so she could have just sat there and waited for it to finish and for the sky to clear up, or try to find a way back after finding the GF troopers she was sent to rescue all dead. There are so many times where she could have turned back and left, but she doesn't because she's too good for that. Probably the creepiest moment for me, though, is making it back to the ship's landing site through another door, and behind some boxes, you find a Luminoth corpse. I had no idea that was there when the game began. Like, of course I didn't, you can't even see it. There are many dead Luminoth that will leave behind journals about how they went down in a blaze of glory, or clues for someone like Samus to find the means to save the planet where they couldn't. So yeah, another very cool, complete feeling world to set a game in. Now let's talk about Prime 3's worlds, because yes, there's more than one. This game has way more worlds than most other Metroid games, but I still kinda consider them all part of one big world in a way. I'll explain. You see, the only real difference between this and the first two Prime games is that areas that were once connected by elevators made to disguise load times are now, in some cases, replaced by an animation of Samus' ship in flight. Backtracking is kind of a big issue for some people when it comes to these games, but not for me. The first Prime game has 4 or 5 elevators in each area, which are supposed to make it easier and quicker to reach certain regions by just going through the right elevator. Heck, all of Magmor Caverns is basically an underground highway connecting all the other areas. It's pretty convenient, but once you've gone back and forth through here a few times, it does get pretty old. If Magmor was shaped more like this, I think it'd be fine. This actually is how Prime 2 does things, with the temple in the exact center of the game's map, the surrounding area forming a giant ring, and the other areas forming a second, even larger ring around that, and each area has elevators connecting them all together. They're kinda like pizza slices, all side by side. Simply accessing these elevators takes some doing, but once you've found them all, backtracking for goodies is surprisingly easy since the world's layout is kinda simple compared to the first game. When it comes to Prime 3, you have the usual elevators or trams or cable cars that replace these sequences, but you also find landing pads where you can call your ship over to hop aboard. It's a little more elaborate than the way the first two games' worlds are constructed, but I still think it's put together pretty well considering how much stuff they had to juggle, and considering you can use your ship to reach any other landing pad on any world that you visited. It's not just a two-way thing anymore, more like 13 ways. And to their credit, some of these worlds, even if they're essentially just one of any given region from a previous game acting as an entire world, are pretty big and interesting in their own right. Norion is essentially a tutorial level. There's not much to say here. Brio makes a pretty fantastic Talon IV light though. You have a jungle level, a pirate base, ruins, a fire level with some unique twist to it. There's even a Shorpa Sweet Ice Cave level, and once you find a way to connect the two biggest areas from both sides of a single room that separates them at the beginning, it becomes a pretty big map. The lore of Brio is short but sweet, covering the Brionians' history in just a dozen entries. Most of these you won't even be able to access right away, but piecing them together creates a harrowing tale of this culture's downfall, as tensions grew between the scientists and the old guard, who eventually went to war with each other over the old and new ways, which is more or less how I see our own civilization ending in a few years. There's also a lot of statues, some of them representing the culture's different deities, which may or may not have actually existed. Unlikely as it may seem, they could have been real for all we know. Considering it's just sort of tacked on, I say they did a pretty good job building this world. I hear there was even more they wanted to add to it, but didn't have time to, also given how much less of a game Brio was given to grow in compared to Talon IV and Aether. SkyTown on planet Elysia is another great setting. The entries you find here detail the history of a race of robots created by the Chozo over 1,000 years ago, and there are Chozo monuments everywhere. The doors and everything look sort of like they did on Talon IV, only more advanced and intricate. Heck, the first landing pad you find on this planet looks just like the temple above the crater on Talon IV. How cool is that? Seriously, I love how much Retro has contributed to the Chozo mythos. The Chozo have such a huge presence in these games. It's just another thing I find disappointing about Other M. The game doesn't ever make it out like the Chozo don't exist, but it completely ignores any role they had in Samus' upbringing because I guess that shit isn't interesting to people anymore. No, someone clearly felt it was much more important to make him an abusive prick who minimizes his actions with shit like, "I'm sorry for getting a little rough with you," and makes Samus a bad housewife who takes his shit and enjoys it while they're at it. Yes, this is more true to the spirit of Metroid. Anyway, the story of the robots is pretty tragic. After a few centuries, they ran out of resources and had to go into sleep mode to conserve their power. That's not the tragic part though, they don't mind sleeping. They just let their satellites feed them information about the galaxy's latest happenings in the form of dreams to keep them up to date about things. Because of this, they saw what happened to Talon IV, and mourned the loss of their beloved creators that now suffered as the Elysians weren't able to help them. Like, you really see how frustrated and helpless they feel, how torn up they are about what happened to the Chozo. It made me feel really bad for these guys that have lost their consciousness and now serve completely under the control of the space pirates as mindless attack drones, which is probably the worst fate a robot can have. It sucks, but man, I don't know how Retro does it, how they keep hammering out one cool world after another, like it's a natural process for them. Without these additions they've made to it, the Metroid universe would feel like a much smaller, less interesting place. Then there's a Pirate's World of Origin, which is probably one of the most hellish places in the series. Their architecture is intense to say the least, and even the way some of their hallways are constructed is just kind of impractical and cramped. But it fits. I mean, of course the pirates would do such a slapdash job on their own turf. It's just the kind of knuckleheads they are in these games. The lore of this planet shows how they came under the control of Dark Samus, building a cult of personality around her and following her every whim, hunting down and murdering any dissenters like she's the best thing to come along since Mother Brain. It's a wonder they were able to scrape by and return to power on Zebes and Super Metroid after the huge losses they suffer in this game. Then there's the living, thinking planet Phaze, which is arguably the true mastermind behind everything in these games. The final stage is just that, a stage. There are no collectibles, no lore entries to find. Heck, the second you step away from your ship, it won't even allow you to use it again because Samus has been so thoroughly mutated by the planet's atmosphere that the ship no longer recognizes her. So this is it, and this world is something else. I don't even know how to describe it, just look at it. It's like being inside a giant blue tumor, with hair and teeth and scabs everywhere. Everything has been building up to this, as Phazon becomes more plentiful in each game, and you see increasingly corrupted environments on each of the 7 worlds you visit, until there's nothing but this as far as the eye can see. It's a great way to end the trilogy. I also like how the space pirates change from game to game. The pirates in the first Metroid Prime are very predatory, and a little primitive. They like to hang from the ceiling to get the drop on you, and the way they run makes them look like animals. They're just a bunch of freaky, vicious-looking monsters with stuff haphazardly jammed into their bodies like braces. It makes me wonder how many of them get infections where their armor and weapons are grafted into their flesh. The pirates you face later in the game look pretty cool, certainly a lot healthier. I will admit, the pirates in Prime 1 are kind of generic. The pirates in the second game look a lot more like you'd expect them to, with huge snapping claws and bug-like bodies, just like in Super Metroid, but still feeling sleek and new. The pirates in the third game are like something out of a sci-fi horror movie. They're a little more Geiger-esque, with all these grooves and tubes and gaps and segmented bits all over. It looks so uncomfortable just to be them. And look at their spaceships! You can walk inside one of them, and you find out it's actually a giant homegrown animal that's just being used as a ship. There are eyes that probably act as cameras, fleshy walls. It's very different compared to the more industrial pirates we see in the other games. Which makes sense since they've probably learned how to grow and farm all this stuff and modify their own bodies by studying and reverse engineering the Leviathans, the massive living spores that Planet Phaze spews out and chucks at other planets like Talon IV and Aether to corrupt them with Phaze and make them clones of itself. I also like the implication Prime 3 makes with Phaze-ing, that the Ing we see on Dark Aether were once Phazon-based lifeforms who just somehow turned into shadow creatures. I will say it is a little cumbersome having so many more dialogue-heavy cutscenes in Prime 3 than in previous games, but a good chunk of them are the kind you can skip through by rapidly pressing a button to skip through the text. You can't skip these cutscenes entirely. The only other thing you can't skip through are loading screens and some actions you perform on your ship. I will say, however, that the game does take a lot longer to get started than either of the first two games did, treating the battle on Olympus and the planet Norian like the first act of a Metroid movie. I still don't mind it that much since it's all to continue escalating the story, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't appreciate the first two games a little more because of how much less intrusive the story is in those games and how much quicker they are to get to the point. Anyway, I guess that's all I have to say about the story of these games. They're all just so rich and neat, and I commend the people at Retro Studios for coming up with so many worlds, especially on Prime 3, and making them all feel distinct and real. Now let's shift focus from the story to pure gameplay stuff. I'll say right off the bat that I can't stand people who brush off games like these as just generic first-person shooters that aren't true to old-school Metroid at all. And yes, they call it a first-person shooter as a criticism, not even just a simple fact. Like, there's something wrong with the very idea, conceptually, of a first-person shooter game, and simply being first-person shooters at all would make these games bad. Actually, no, I take that back. It's not because shooters by nature are inherently bad games. It's more because of the nasty culture that's built up around first-person shooters that Nintendo fans hate. The Doritofication of gaming, to quote Movie Bob. But I think that makes a hatred for these games even less justifiable. First off, just look at how intricate these maps are and how the rooms are constructed. This is what a 3D Metroid world should ideally look like. Lots of big rooms connected together by foreboding hallways in a vast network where no one place is ever really that far away once you open all the intersecting pathways and shortcuts. Like I said before, even in Prime 3's more condensed worlds, they managed to pull this off pretty well. You're not trapped in a long corridor from beginning to end, mowing down enemies left and right. It should be clear by now that the worlds you're exploring in these games are very true to how the old-school 2D games were built. But look, I know that isn't what people are actually complaining about. They don't look that deep. It's not the world itself of Metroid Prime that bothers people, aside from the backtracking. It's the camera angle. A lot of people just have this really weird hate boner for any game that lets you see things from this perspective and have you shoot stuff, but you're doing a lot more than just shooting in these games. It's more like a first-person adventure series that just has shooting in it. Heck, it's not even just me saying this, it's Nintendo itself that classified it this way. Ever since Call of Duty took off, people suddenly hate anything that even somewhat vaguely resembles it, and I think this hate is completely unwarranted. Like, just look at this shit.
This is, or rather should be, a game-changing, teachable moment in modern game design. And, on a very personal note for me, it's not another first-person shooter. Hallelujah! Hallelujah!
Yeah, I know I just quoted the guy, but I'm never letting this go. Oh, a few games in this genre are to blame for everything wrong with gaming today, so I'm going to unfairly lump games like this into a camp of things that are not okay! That's basically what other people are saying. Yeah, that's totally something to be proud of. It's taking a stand against this game. Even way back when the first Prime game was released, it got some hate. I've seen so many people that will even say, yeah, look, the Prime games are good in their own right, but I just can't support them on principle. As if that actually means anything. So they're essentially reveling in their own biases, even admitting how biased they are, waving it around like a flag. Like they're so proud to be willfully ignorant. It's one of the worst mindsets I see in gaming. Saying you can't support a perfectly legitimate game simply to take a stand and stick it to the industry as a whole, or just other games that you don't like is incredibly narrow-minded and unfair. The problem with looking at every piece of work through some broader cultural lens instead of on the product's own terms is that it becomes hard to appreciate or even see the things that the product does right, and so works suffer on an individual basis in a way that is completely unnecessary. It's a camera angle, people. The game is nothing like Call of Duty or whatever FPSs you think are stupid. It has so much more merit, so much more soul than those games, as I'll delve into near the end of the review. For now, I'll just say that the first-person perspective really doesn't change the game in any drastic way. Would you call Zelda an FPS if it switched to this perspective, but the world was largely unchanged and you didn't spend that much time shooting at stuff with arrows and is still largely focused on solving puzzles and exploring an intricate environment? No, you'd call it an adventure game. Well, that's what Metroid Prime is like. Heck, supposedly, Ocarina of Time was originally going to be a first-person game, but they changed it because they didn't want it to be compared to first-person shooters. Gee, I wonder why. As for Metroid Prime, this makes it a lot less clunky than it probably would have been at the time if they had the game played differently. Heck, they were going to make a third-person adventure shooter game for a time, but Miyamoto himself decided that the game would flow better and the world would be easier to explore if done from a first-person perspective. Some people actually think the game was made this way to rip off Halo Combat Evolved and capitalize on its success, when these changes were made to Metroid Prime pretty early in development, well before that game was even released. These people spread this misinformation with complete sincerity to justify how stupid they think the Prime games are. I think calling it an FPS, even if you're not saying that as a criticism or an insult, but just what it looks like to you, is still belittling to these games because it makes it sound like there's nothing else to them, when the shooting elements are such a small element. Anyway, rant over. Now let's talk about the controls. I do have a couple of gripes with the way this game plays, but for the most part, Samus' controls are pretty great. She turns quickly and walks at a brisk pace. Some people who can't come up with anything else to criticize these games for point to how slow Samus is compared to how fast she runs in the 2D games. Considering Samus never gets a speed upgrade in these games though, I'd say it's a pretty respectable pace. She's not slow by any means, she just makes a very big stride. She's taking wide steps like she's skipping or jogging. You still get around pretty quickly. I think what people are pointing to is the frequency of her steps, but considering her blaster bobs up and down every time she takes a step, I think it would be pretty annoying, or at least a little distracting, if she was moving up and down super fast but her model wasn't actually sliding along the ground any faster. It's a stupid point, but I felt the need to bring it up anyway. One thing I really like about Samus in these games is how heavy she is. Samus' physics are great. She's clunky in all the right ways for someone stomping around in a super suit like this. When you jump, she has this really nice weight to her, and simple things like the space jump feel powerful because of it. When you use a space jump though, you're making a commitment. Now I'm mainly talking about the GameCube version here. I won't say Samus' jumping arc always goes in a perfect straight line, there is a little bit of give to it, but once you get going, it's hard to change the direction of your jump much. It's like if you took a bowling ball with a little person trapped inside it and just threw it. What's a helpless person inside the ball supposed to do once they're in the air? Instead of using the joystick to drastically alter Samus' trajectory, you can instead use it to spin her around and point at targets on your way to wherever you're landing. I really appreciate this choice. I don't know exactly how this works, but it makes you less helpless than you would be if you always had to be looking in the direction you're jumping, and it's good for multitasking. But man, I wasn't kidding when I said Samus is heavy. One of my favorite things to do in these games is find a really high platform or ledge and just jump. After a second or so, you start to feel like a rock is tied to your foot, and you get this feeling in your stomach like, oh geez, now I've done it. Like when you're in the passenger seat of a car going down a steep hill. You're just being dragged along while the person in the driver's seat gets a rush. The Prime series is one of the few instances where any game has ever given me a real case of vertigo. I don't know how they do it. Don't worry about her ankles, she'll walk that off. The Morph Ball controls are also great. There are a lot of puzzles built around using the Morph Ball, especially in the second and third games. Just these huge platforming stretches where you have to use bombs, the Spider Ball, and Spring Ball to make it through. These are pretty suspenseful, and most of them are super fun and satisfying. Because of this, I think restricting the use of the Spider Ball to certain tracks was a great move. Being able to use it on every wall would break the game. Interestingly, this game plays entirely in third person, so you can see where the ball is. I like this move. I can understand not making the rest of the game third person since you'd have to implement some kind of auto-aim mechanic and scanning would probably be very awkward, but rolling in third person gives you a great degree of control over the Morph Ball. I like to roll down slopes and half-pipes and such. It kinda feels like how Sonic ought to roll in 3D. Good rolling physics. Regular platforming in first-person mode is satisfying as well, with a good idea of where you're going to land before you even jump. You just develop a sense for this stuff after a little while, and the sequel's controls are pretty much identical. So yeah, the controls in general are good. That said, all of her movements will be updated in Prime 3. She's not that different here, though she does feel a little more light on her feet, and everything feels a lot more responsive and connected. There are lots of minor improvements all across the board that make Samus feel like a well-oiled machine. For example, in Prime 2, the screw attack chucks you straight ahead with very little give. In Prime 3, the screw attack feels much nicer to use. It's a fair bit easier to turn, so if your aim is a little off, you can usually correct your course, and I've even managed to get around a few of the bigger curves this way. Then there are other changes, like being able to swing on grapple beam targets and shoot with your other arm at the same time. The beams themselves are okay. I like that they have different properties in the first two Prime games, different power levels, different rates of fire, different effects on enemies, and combining them with missiles to make super weapons is pretty sweet. Few things in the Prime games are as satisfying as obliterating an enemy with a well-timed super missile, or encasing several enemies in ice at once. In Prime 2 you get the light, dark, and annihilator beams, which have ammo counts, oddly enough. Some people don't like this change, but I think it's pretty clever. The dark beam is extremely powerful in the light world and will take most enemies down quick, while the light beam is more useful against dark creatures from Dark Aether. Go figure. My favorite design decision though is how you replenish ammo by destroying an enemy or item cache with the opposite beam. This encourages you to make use of both beams, and yeah, it's easy to run out of ammo at first, but there are several expansions that eventually result in a huge ammo count, and even if you do run out, even the power beam will sometimes spawn ammo for the other beams, and it's still pretty useful, not quite as outclassed by other beams as it is in the first and third game. It's all more situational in Prime 2. I also like that there are enemies who change their polarity from light to dark and back, prompting you to switch weapons to take advantage of their current weakness, like it's a Mega Man game. The Annihilator beam drawing from both other weapons and dropping pickups to replenish both ammo counts from defeated enemies is a neat choice too. I could have lived without this system, sure, but it's not bad. It just keeps you thinking on your toes about resource management, though I understand if some don't want to worry about that in a Metroid game. I also love how well designed Samus' arm cannon is in these games, how it opens and extends and expands and compresses into all these different shapes. It's a work of art. Interestingly, while the first two games let you switch between beams to open differently colored doors, Prime 3 stacks the beams atop each other, but it's not done like it is in Super Metroid. In that game, you can choose which weapons to stack together, combining the effects from all of them into one beam that freezes things, and also passes through walls and enemies, and splits into multiple beams. But if you want to remove a beam effect for any reason, you can. In Prime 3 it's a lot simpler. Once you equip a new beam, it permanently replaces that previous beam, so you're stuck with it forever, though you can still open doors with that earlier beam's colors. Each beam is more powerful than the last, but they all have basically the same rate of fire. While the Nova beam might fire a little faster, the Plasma beam's shots seem to travel a little faster. You get what I mean? So when I shoot these targets in SkyTown, it's almost guaranteed to connect with a Plasma beam, while I have to try hard to hit them with a Nova beam. I think these stretches were clearly designed with the Plasma beam in mind, and if you come back to these parts looking for items with a Nova beam, you might have a little bit of trouble. It's one of very few missteps in this series where something kinda goes backwards, I feel. Yeah, some of the minigames in Prime 3 are a little clunky, but I don't mind most of them. The welding minigames are kinda fun, the lasso is satisfying to use, and I do get a little thrill out of feeling like some really smart space engineer who can fix shit instead of just blowing it up. Yeah, work it. Anyway, we'll get back to aiming in a little bit. Let's move on to collectibles. Like you'd expect, each game has 100 important items to collect. They're mostly what you'd expect. New equipment for your suit, new beams, new suits, then there's all the energy tanks, missile expansions, power bombs, and artifacts. Yeah, those things I mentioned earlier. We'll get back to that. Most of the places these pickups are hidden are pretty clever. Sometimes they'll really make you work to get that one power bomb upgrade, preparing lengthy platforming structures for you or making you deactivate a machine to open a door. And sometimes they're just hidden behind a wall that you need to break with a bomb or a missile. One thing I really appreciate is the way most of these items, if not all of them, emit a distinct humming sound, so the closer you get, the louder it is. And it's not annoying or anything, it's extremely helpful and will save you a lot of time. But it doesn't make things too easy either. You have to be pretty close to notice a sound, and you still have to figure out exactly where the item is and how to access it. It could be right under your nose, but you don't see it. Sometimes the visors can help. In Prime 1 you get the thermal visor and the X-ray visor, which help you see heat sources in darkly lit areas, or spot invisible platforms, or see through weak breakable walls. The dark visor in Prime 2 does kinda the same thing, spotting invisible objects I mean, and the echo visor is kinda tricky, but if you use it in conjunction with the annihilator beam, it's pretty easy to use. In Prime 3 you get a new X-ray visor, which is kinda like if you combine the X-ray visor and thermal visors from the first game into one new visor. You can use it to spot enemy weak points and penetrate special armor to hit vulnerable spots with a Nova beam and kill lots of tougher enemies, even some mini-bosses, with a single shot. By the way, I like that the first thing she sees when she puts the visor on in this game is us, the player on the other side of the screen. I also like seeing Samus' face reflected on the inside of the visor when there's a flash or something nearby. It kinda scared me the first time it happened though. In Prime 3, you see Samus' face all the time when in scan visor mode, so you get to see her grow sickly and deformed as face invades her body throughout the game. It's really creepy. I also love the way the suit looks in all these games. They made a lot of little changes to it in Prime 2 and 3, but even in the first game it looks amazing. I like that even the lights change color each time you get a new suit in the first game, and how the PED suit changes each time you destroy a Leviathan seed in Prime 3. And in Prime 2, oh man, the dark suit gets totally decked out. It's fun to get new equipment like the gravity booster and see all this stuff piled onto it. At first I thought the dark suit was a little dry and bare bones, but it works great as a platform for all these upgrades and looks badass with all this stuff equipped. And the light suit is simply elegant, probably one of the most beautiful and alien suits Samus has ever worn. The PED suit in Prime 3 is interesting. It has lots of greebly bits, but it still looks nice, and again I like how it changes as the game goes on, with new seams appearing for Phaze to glow through, looking more alive and mutated near the end. Anyway, I've gone on long enough about Samus's items. Let's talk about the Chozo artifacts, the Sky Temple keys, and the fuel cells. At the end of each Prime game, you'll need to have collected a certain number of trinkets and MacGuffins to unlock the final area and defeat the last boss. It's sort of like how you had to beat the 4 major power bosses to reach Mother Brain in Super Metroid, only a little more tedious. A little. It only ever gets really annoying in Prime 2, for a few reasons. In Prime 1, if you're already on the hunt for items, chances are you already have like half of them by the time you reach the gate at the end of the game, and the statues there give hints about where the remaining ones are. And I know people hate backtracking in these sorts of games, but I always like doing cleanup at the end of a Metroid game and easily crushing enemies that once gave me a hard time now that I'm so much more powerful than I was before, or easily spotting all sorts of other items with my new equipment. It's just part of the larger appeal of these games, is being able to blow through them at the end. I will admit, the lack of player choice in this case is a little annoying. It's not nearly as annoying as it is in Prime 2 though. At least in Prime 1, the artifacts are about as easy to find as any other item in the game. In the next game, there are fewer artifacts, but they're much more out of the way. For one thing, they're all in the Dark World. Another thing, all of them, save one, are contained in special link bodies that can't be seen until you shoot them while wearing the Dark Visor. Okay, so that doesn't sound so bad, right? You just get the Dark Visor 2/3 through the game, and you'll find them easy peasy, right? No. A good chunk of these containers are underwater, and Dark Aether's water is so thick and so caustic that you can't safely enter or even see through the stuff until you have the light suit at the very end of the game. Okay, this is obnoxious and forced. It's bearable though. I mean, it is nice to go on a power trip with the light suit and make the Dark World suddenly look like a walk in the park, and the Dead Luminons do tell you the exact rooms these are in, so you just look them up and head over there, but still. Yes, backtracking comes with a territory in games like this, but the reason it's so annoying in Prime 2's case is because it all gets foisted on you at the very last second. It's especially annoying on repeat playthroughs, or if you're just so savvy that you come to a room like this, and you instinctively know that there has to be a key here. There's nothing else to give this room any purpose. And if you were properly equipped, you could go get it right now. Better yet, they could just plop it at the end of a tricky platforming section across the lake, or hide it inside an old monument or something, like the first game would. But nope, you'll just have to come back to all these areas later on when the poisonous water is suddenly made harmless and irrelevant. This is one of few things in these games I can call artificially difficult with complete sincerity. It is so roundabout, it's just unnecessary. Prime 3 is much nicer about all of this. In this game, to find the coordinates to planet Phaze, you need to download it from a rated Federation ship, the Valhalla. In this case, each fuel cell, one of which you'll find right outside, is used to open a door. Now, not every door will bring you closer to the room you need to reach, so do be careful about which doors you choose to open, but if you go the right way, you only need half of the 10 fuel cells to reach this room, and just like Prime 1, you can get most of them along the way. In fact, you do take just a few of them in the story to deactivate power machinery and stuff. So yeah, getting these collectibles in Prime 3 is easy. Especially if you use this computer room in SkyTown to download the locations of every item in each map, which I didn't even know you could do until I found out by accident in a recent playthrough. I think it only works once you've actually been to these worlds yourself though, then you can download the treasure map for that area. This makes last minute cleanups a lot faster, and I wouldn't say this kind of thing is needed in either of the first two games, but when you roll all of Prime 3's worlds together, this is easily the biggest Metroid Prime game of all, and without this addition, it would get downright overwhelming, having to find everything blindly. Anyway, item collecting in these games is really fun and rewarding like you'd expect in a Metroid game, at least most of the time. It does get a little cryptic now and then, but not unbearably so. If there's one thing this series does right, it's enemies and bosses. There is a huge variety of them to fight in these games. Talon IV features its share of familiar enemies from Super Metroid, that I guess you could say were brought over here by the Chozo. But there's a bigger share of completely new enemies specific to the planet. Some of them are really unique, and the bosses were pretty great for the time. Lots of them are just mini-bosses that in all honesty are pretty easy. Each boss introduced early on exists to get you to grips with one of the mechanics until you reach Flagger and have to put all these skills to use in a titanic battle. There's a few other giant bosses like this, but those are spaced apart with more medium-sized bosses in between, like this Sheegoth. What's interesting about bosses like these is that sometimes there's more than one way to beat them. You can shoot the Sheegoth in the mouth with a missile here and there as they hyperventilate and need to stop for a moment, or drop Morph Ball bombs at their feet. Some of these sub-bosses seem like a big deal the first time you meet them, but then reappear a couple times in other locations as just another enemy, to show how much stronger you've become since those early encounters, and how easy it should be to deal with these things now that they're much less of a threat. You can completely incinerate this beetle with one charge shot once you get the plasma beam. Bigger bosses like Thardas are treated sort of like a boss in a 3D Zelda game, only less patronizing. You know how in a lot of recent Zelda games you'll get a power-up in a dungeon and then that power-up turns out to be the crippling weakness of that dungeon's boss? Yeah, shocking, I know. It gets pretty repetitive and routine after a while. These bosses aren't quite like that though. Often, you'll need to make use of 3 or 4 different things to break down their defenses, some of which you've already had for a while, and not just that one special thing you picked up 50 minutes ago. For example, using the thermal visor, you can detect heat signatures inside parts of Thardas to strike. However, once you damage those bits, the stuff inside is exposed and your thermal visor is overloaded by the energy released, and you can't see anything for a while, so you can't rely on that visor the whole time. You have to juggle several different mechanics in encounters like this. Some of the later bosses in these games still have you using things like Morph Ball Bombs to beat them, but that's not a bad thing. It's just how they mix up old and new mechanics by making you use them together and sometimes in very new ways. Then there are bits like the Ridley fight, which are much less complicated. Retro knew that we just wanted to have a simple throwdown with this guy, no fluff. I can respect that. Though the fight does drag a bit since there are only so many ways to hurt him. As for Metroid Prime itself, this super highly evolved, almost godlike creature, I'd say it makes a pretty fitting final boss, forcing you to use all of your beam weapons and all of your visors. Again, I just wish Kraid was somewhere in this game. Moving on, the bosses in Prime 2 are some of the best in this series, but man, they're tough. Of course, you've got the bigger ones that, like in the first game, force you to make use of several gizmos and weapons throughout the battle, and the creatures themselves feel larger than life, pushing the GameCube to its limits just to make these fights possible. But then you've got a good amount of smaller bosses too. The wildlife on Light Aether is very cool and unique. It felt much more like Retro had developed their own style by this point, and they came up with some crazy exotic new animals to sick on you. A fair number of the bosses are just that, normal animals that get horribly mutated and turn into weaponized monsters by the Ying. My favorite bosses are the ones that make use of Samus' own weapons and turn them against her. Even something that sounds as underwhelming as the Bomb Worm has a few extra tricks up its sleeve. Like, it won't just leave a trail of bombs behind it, sometimes it'll spray a hailstorm of bombs all over the battlefield. Some of these don't even really feel like bosses per se, just nifty little challenges to spice things up and make you work a little harder for the goodies. Still, like I said, these bosses are much harder than most of the bosses in Metroid Prime 1. They're not stupid hard or even unfair, they can just get a little overwhelming. And like I said earlier, the Dark Samus fights are something else. Metroid Prime 3's bosses are where things get interesting, but still kinda weird. They're more of the same to a degree, but they take advantage of the new aiming controls in some pretty surprising ways, and some of these fights can drag a little bit. They're still fun, but if there'd ever been a Prime 4, I think the bosses would be similar to this game's bosses, only quicker and less clumsy. Still, this game has some really fun boss fights, a few of the best in the series I'd say. If you want a rundown of all the bosses in the trilogy in greater detail from worst to best, check out Speedster's list. I don't agree with all of his choices, but it's a good list. As for the other enemies in Metroid Prime 3, I know a lot of people say this is the easiest of the trilogy because Samus has hyper mode, which makes her a little overpowered at times, but so are the enemies. Good lord, some of these enemies have a stupid amount of health. They're also faster than a lot of enemies in previous games where they fire more shots, the shots are bigger and harder to dodge and do a ton of damage, and if you're not careful about how much you use hyper mode, which drains your health and converts it to power every time, you may end up on your last energy tank, trapped in a room with a couple of particularly powerful pirates who won't leave you alone, and they're draining you faster than you're draining them. So I find myself dying in this game like 10 times more than in the other two games. I always die at least a few times in each playthrough simply because there's so many more variables introduced in this game's combat to take into account. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. It is fairly easy most of the time, but there are lots of choke points where it's do or die, and sometimes I die. It just happens. It's hard for me to say which game is the most challenging overall. Prime 1 is the most basic and the easiest to come back to, for me anyway. I can come back to this game year after year and always have fun. Prime 2 I don't play quite as often as the first. It's still good, and it's not that hard. It just gets pretty draining because there's the most busy work. Prime 3 is kind of a breeze at times, but that can change in a second. On the whole, I'd say the series is decently challenging. It leaves plenty of room for beginners and veterans. It all depends on how much of a klepto you are. Now for the music and graphics. The graphics of all three Prime games hold up pretty well, I think. Prime 1 has a simplest art style, and most of the settings look primitive and dingy, but I think it's fitting for this world. Everything on Talon IV is dilapidated and falling to pieces. Even the space-powered facilities feel kinda cheaply put together, which seems like the kind of thing they do since they're just recovering from their defeat on Zeebs. Some of the textures are kind of pixely, but otherwise, I think Prime 1 still holds up and looks beautiful in its own somber, if not super dreary way to this day. I remember years ago some chud at my old man's house was walking by, stopped to watch me play it for a few seconds, and all he could think of to say was, "Oh yeah, Halo blows this out of the water." And then he walked away. Thanks. Like, gee, did you come here just to say that to validate yourself? Whatever. Prime 2 is very different. In fact, I'm not afraid to say I think it looks much better than the first game, thanks to how well Retro was able to construct this new setting with some great new art direction, and the textures and all the little effects are just nicer across the board. It's essentially the same game, but it looks much cleaner. Prime 3 is the biggest departure from earlier games, I think. Not only do you get a ton of new worlds, each with their own architecture and denizens, all being very different, but the designs are some of the most complex yet. It never goes overboard, but dang, this stuff is awe-inspiring at times. It makes me wish these guys could keep making games like this, bringing more amazing worlds to life. You can kinda see a little of Prime 3 and Halo 4's art style, at least I think so. The Prime games just look solid. I understand if some of the visuals of the first two games look a little bland to some people, but that's kinda the entire point. These are dying worlds. Of course they feel barren at times, they're supposed to. If they didn't, I think there'd be something wrong with that. If that's not your thing though, I understand. I just see a certain grand design behind it all, a rhyme and reason that shows how purposeful this all was. It never gives me the impression that the designers were being lazy or felt uninspired and weren't putting a lot of thought into what they were building, and that completeness makes it beautiful to me. The music of the Prime games is something else. It's not quite like any soundtrack I've heard for any other game series. Now here's the thing about games with atmospheric soundtracks. A lot of times, in trying to create an atmosphere, the composers won't even bother to craft any semblance of a melody. They just loosely chain a bunch of boring sounds together to make the setting of the game feel spooky or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that in some games, but this is Metroid, a series known for its music, full of distinct, memorable tunes that people have remixed many times over the years because the songs were just that inspiring. In fact, Kenji Yamamoto, the composer of Super Metroid, was brought aboard to compose the music of the Prime games. How cool is that? Now this is a guy who knows how to build an intense mood while keeping the tunes memorable. He's the kind of guy who comes up with his stuff by humming it to himself when driving his motorcycle to work. Is it any wonder his music is so inspired? By comparison, a lot of some other composers' attempts at creating an atmosphere fall pretty flat. Now true, Kenji does this a little bit too, but he does it right. Even his more atmospheric pieces made for those quiet moments are still intense, and can just as easily be soothing or skin-crawling. A lot of the stuff in Metroid Prime is underplayed, but very alien and pretty emotional at times. It's not just noise. It feels like you're being absorbed into something large and sinister, and cements itself in your memory by being so breathing. But then there are really peaceful, mellow tracks like Phendrana Drifts. The first Prime game is some of the most tragic music, and it conveys the awful state of the world pretty well. And whenever you're near Phase in these games, the music takes an interesting turn that I just don't quite know how to describe. Just listen. It's like a Geiger counter has become sentient and is trying to communicate with you or something. The games all have their share of remixes of tunes from Super Metroid and even the first Metroid, like these. Considering who the composer is, this should come as no surprise, but he's also come up with a ton of original tunes that fit right in with his older melodies perfectly, and have become pretty famous among Metroid fans, and the instruments he uses to pull this off really show how his music has evolved since his earlier work in the Super Nintendo days. The man's amazing. My favorite track in Prime 2 might actually be Torva's Bog, of all things, a pretty easygoing track made for this game that sets a great mood for the area, and now and then you'll find that one tune that's just exceptional. It really elevates the series to new heights. I think the credit scene of Metroid Prime is the best tune in the trilogy, and one of the best in the entire Metroid series, if not one of the best songs in any video game period. It's so eerie, it's perfect in a way. It says so many things about the series. It tells you everything you need to know about its entire appeal, the things that make people love it to this day. Every time I hear it at the end of this game, I get a little choked up inside. It's symbolic of so many things that I love within the series, and just in general about sci-fi. If I ever make a list of my top 10 favorite tunes in gaming, oh, you can bet this will be pretty high on that list. So yeah, the Prime Trilogy is pretty great. It looks great, it sounds great, and it plays great. Great. Mostly. Yeah, these games may be pretty awesome, but they aren't perfect. Like, no joke guys, Metroid Prime is my favorite game, period. But, it could be better. In fact, it is now. I'll explain. You see, along with a third game in the series, the Trilogy collection introduces this nifty little thing to the earlier games called aiming. And it really elevates the first two Prime games. Now some of you might think I'm just joshing, but no, this is a real problem with the original Prime games that didn't bug me until I saw how much better things could be. In the first two games, the methods for aiming your blaster are pretty primitive. You can't aim and move at the same time. To properly aim at targets, you need to hold down one of the shoulder buttons to fasten yourself to the ground like a turret, making yourself an easy target to hit. It's kinda like Jet Force Gemini. If you're running around, all you can do is shoot straight ahead when an enemy happens to line up with your cannon. There is a bit of a way around this. Using the aforementioned shoulder button, you follow it up by then holding down the other shoulder button when there are no targets to lock onto, and then let go of the first one. You can keep yourself aimed in another direction. Now, instead of always shooting straight ahead like an idiot, you can make yourself look like an even bigger idiot by always shooting off to the side, or up, or at the ground. To make up for this, they give you a lock-on mechanic, and while it never bothered me back in the day, this is what killed Metroid Prime for a fair number of people. You might not have heard anybody complain about this before, but they're out there, trust me, and it's one of the few criticisms I consider pretty valid in this day and age. I remember one guy on DeviantArt even calling the first Metroid Prime baby's first FPS. The lock-on mechanic is downright game-breaking. I'm not gonna pretend it isn't. Just hold it down when an enemy is in your sights, and unless something knocks the wind out of Samus, she'll stay trained on that enemy, and in the case of bosses, usually their weak point. All you have to do then is dodge to the side when they attack, and fire like a madman whenever you have the chance to until the enemy dies. So you don't even have to aim, which is nice, considering aiming is kinda broken. In the third Metroid Prime, things are completely different. For the most part, aiming is manual. The lock-on mechanic is still there, but I don't feel it's nearly as needed now, and even if you use it, you still need to point the nunchucks so that you're actually aiming at the center of the screen. So there is still a good amount of player input and skill required here. They try to make little puzzles out of the bosses and many of the enemies, giving them multiple weak points that you have to shoot in a sequence, or shields that you have to dismantle or remove before destroying them. And there are all sorts of other little things throughout the game that make good use of the aiming controls. For example, you know how you shoot doors to deactivate whatever energy field is keeping them closed? The giant stone doors on Brio just have this little part in the middle for you to shoot, like a lock. That's neat. Not all of the doors in the game are like that, but Brio is one of the first planets you visit, so this is a good friendly way to teach the player how to aim early on. Another thing I've noticed is that with the aiming controls, I have a much easier time hitting most of the enemies in the previous two games. At first, I thought it was weird that the pirates in this game look so much more spindly than usual, but now I think it was intentional, so there'd be a smaller hitbox for you to have to hit. I admit, Prime 3 always felt kinda weird to me, and the first two times I played it, it took me a while to get to grips with the new controls, but once I applied the same controls to the earlier games, those games I already loved became like twice as good. I went back to Metroid Prime 1 in the Trilogy version, and even though I'd played the GameCube version of the game many times before, playing it this way suddenly made it feel like a completely new experience again. I tried to make it through as much of the game as I could without ever locking onto anything, just having to manually aim at all the war wasps and stuff. Many bosses that used to be easy for me were suddenly giving me trouble like the first time I played Metroid Prime years ago. There are so many new variables now. I had more control over what was happening, but there were so many new ways I could lose control and had to be extra careful not to, because not only were the aiming controls different, Samus's controls in general were updated to accommodate these changes, just like in Prime 3. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore, like you do when replaying most older games. It made these old battles exciting again. My heart was actually racing at times, and I wasn't even sure these games could still do that to me. Being able to hit Thardus' weak points while he rolls around, or land a charge shot on one of the dishes around Flagra, or just shoot Ridley in the mouth without having to lock onto anything, is so satisfying and elevates this already great game to being downright stellar. It was great going through all these classic encounters again, and making it all feel new and special. As soon as I was done with that, I jumped into Prime 2 and noticed something else. These games are so much faster with Prime 3's controls and the addition of the spring ball. Seriously, being able to run and shoot and turn whenever you want at the same time, rarely having to actually stop for anything, improves the flow of these games a lot. Like, there's a momentum to things now. You keep going, and it just makes things less of a hassle. No longer do you have to wait for Morph Ball bombs to explode to make it onto a ledge. You can just jump. By the time I made it back to Prime 3, I'd pretty much mastered these controls, and my next run of the game was a lot less clumsy than earlier runs. It was all like one giant game where things just kept escalating and getting crazier, and it gave me a new appreciation for this Prime game in particular. I also managed to 100% all of these games in that super run without that much trouble. And then it was over. Before I go any further, I need you to keep in mind that the experiences I'm about to cover happened well before AM2R was released, which has since satisfied my craving for a legitimate new Metroid game, and probably would have had the same effect I'm about to describe if it had come a year or so ago. And of course, it's also before Federation Forces Ending gave me some small measure of newfound hope for a new Prime-ish game to come along someday. So remember, this entire next segment takes place in a pre-AM2R world. You know that feeling you get when you've read a really good book, like exceptionally good, and then you reach the last page and you feel like tearing up a little bit, because you'll miss the characters and the world and part of you doesn't want it to be over? That's the feeling I got as Prime 3's credits rolled up and I watched the Trilogy Collection's title screen again. I got so sucked into these games on a level that I thought I'd never feel again. And yeah, I was sad that it couldn't go on. I reflected on the state of Metroid in recent years, how it just doesn't seem like Nintendo is interested in making real, meaty Metroid games anymore, and there's never going to be another Metroid game like this, or even as good as these three. I felt kinda lost and just stared at my TV screen for another minute or two, thinking about where to go next. Then, I remembered that I did have another Metroid game on my Wii U, and now seemed like as good a time as any to boot it up. I'd only ever played it once, a year or so before, and I liked it a lot, so I figured I'd give it another go. Yep, it's Super Metroid. And there's something I never quite realized about it that after just coming out of those other games, finally clicked. Metroid Prime is Super Metroid. No, seriously, it's the exact same game, just with the camera switched around so you see it from Samus's perspective instead of from next to her, which does not ruin the gameplay no matter how persistently some annoying people may try to convince you it does. I give Other M a lot of flack for shamelessly pandering to people, duping them into thinking that it has the spirit of Metroid with its overly nostalgic imagery. Again, laser Cheerios and whatnot, but the first Prime game is a little guilty of that too, just on a much grander scale. You start the game by investigating a space station where things went to hell shortly before you arrived. You fight a monster, then bail as it blows up, and yeah, Ridley's there. You land on the planet's surface where it's raining, you explore some of the wilderness, you go to an underground fire level, a partially submerged shipwreck, which in Prime's case is the station you escaped at the beginning, there's Chozo ruins, there's a plant monster, a glass hallway you can destroy with a power bomb, 2 space power facilities. There's a ton of stuff here reminiscent of Super Metroid, and if that's where the similarities ended, I'd have to write it off as pandering and shallow just like Other M. But I won't, because Retro backed it up with Super Metroid's rock-solid gameplay. Yeah, it doesn't just look like Super Metroid, it's not doing its best impression of Super Metroid, it plays like Super Metroid. And not in terms of Super's outdated control scheme like Other M tried to recapture, I'm talking about the philosophy of games like Super. Here, the visuals and motifs are more of a proof of concept than a nostalgic throwback, a statement of sorts that, yes, you can craft a world like this in 3D and have it turn out just fine. It's frosting on that gameplay cake. I wouldn't be this forgiving if the cake part wasn't so good. The way maps are constructed, the way you connect different areas together and open new paths, the way you comb areas looking for goodies, the way you approach enemies. Heck, you have to approach everything in this game with the exact same mindset that kept you alive, the same you'd use jumping into Super Metroid and vice versa. So after weeks of being so immersed in the Prime games, playing Super Metroid became second nature to me, despite being on a different dimensional plane. The camera angle was the only thing making these games any different from each other, and it really doesn't change that much about either game. It's a surprisingly inconsequential difference that doesn't really affect either game in any significant or negative way. Other M tries to feel like Super Metroid on a more cloying level, with claustrophobic boxed-in areas that keep you looking at Samus from the side a lot of the time, and a primitive control scheme that uses a D-pad in a 3D space to simulate the feel that you're still kinda sorta playing a 2D game. Like that's important to this series somehow. And it just doesn't work for me because it is still ultimately a fully 3D game, but the world is so unlike anything you'd expect a Metroid world to be like, 2D or not. It's so cut and dry, and the ways they try to hide this come off as downright manipulative to me. If we're gonna talk about abstract, vague things like the spirit of the series, the soul of Metroid, alright, let me put it this way. Other M's developers understand what Super Metroid is, but they don't understand what makes it great. Retro does understand. They always have. I'm not gonna pretend that I'm the most dedicated fan of Super Metroid in the world. I've only played it in recent years, but I managed to get 96 of the collectibles in my second run simply by applying the same thinking that the Prime games taught me to have, because they're consistent with Super's quite literal style of world building, whereas Other M has a shiny coat of paint that makes it look like Super Metroid, but it doesn't actually play like Super Metroid. It doesn't feel like Super Metroid to me, aside from some of the art direction. Prime does. There are so many charming little touches that make Prime feel like a lived-in, breathing world where anything could surprise you, just like Super Metroid. Metroid Prime is the first Metroid game I ever played, and I know what some people will say to that. That is just nostalgia. That if only I play old-school Metroid games enough, I'll wisen up and realize why the Prime games are stupid and Other M is superior. But weirdly, the more I play other older Metroid games, the more I appreciate the Prime games for what they did. Metroid Prime successfully captured everything that made other Metroid games great, that Other M could only half-heartedly mimic. I always knew the games were similar, but I never realized that they were the exact same game just in different dimensions. I mean, Prime does do some things differently, but I wouldn't say that the additions like the scan visor take anything away from the classic formula, because they're just that, additions. Nothing's being taken away or sacrificed for dumb new gimmicks. It's Super Metroid plus this other stuff. What's my point? Metroid Prime, for all the flack people give it, taught me how to play games like Super Metroid like a seasoned veteran. I just don't understand how people can continue to insist after all these years that these aren't real Metroid games. I think it's kind of amazing that it's possible for a game like Metroid Prime to exist at all in any form. The simple fact that this game is there and I can play it blows me away now that I understand Metroid the way I do. There's so many ways this easily could have gone wrong, so many ways the game could have turned out badly and been the stupid Halo ripoff or whatever that uninformed people love to claim it is because it makes them feel good to say it. But I am floored that Retro Studios was able to give Super Metroid such a spot-on seamless transition from 2D to 3D on their first try. Seeing how many games don't survive that jump or try to change too much when making that transition, just that Prime turned out the way it did is an awesome feat in itself, and its sequels give Retro plenty of room to add more original material and tell other bizarre new stories with Samus at the helm. I just think these games have contributed too much to the world of Metroid, its gameplay, its lore, its atmosphere, everything that makes this series important, to write it off as unnecessary or not nearly as deep as Other M, which has emotions! A game which completely deconstructs the Metroid formula in all the wrong ways. It just seems so backwards to me. Like these people remember playing Super Metroid as children, but they haven't played it recently and they don't really remember what made it so interesting, just the blurry images in their heads. Kinda like how I described the devs of Other M. The Prime games have made the Metroid universe a bigger, richer, and more interesting place, fleshing out the Chozo, other races, and Samus' connection to everything. Compared to that, the hokey drama in Other M, and Samus' borderline abusive, toxic relationship with Adam come off as a belittling soap opera that does nothing to enrich this universe, and speaks badly of these characters. I'm fine with Other M existing. For all my bashing, I'm not here to destroy it or whatever, I don't even really hate it, I'm just too jaded to muster the energy to feel that way about it. If people like it more than I do, that's fine, I'm not gonna take that away from them or call them stupid or whatever. I will, however, stand up for these games when they're dismissed as stupid first-person shooters by people who are just overly biased against a freaking camera angle that doesn't matter and who don't really think that deeply about games on any other level, or who put people down for having the audacity, the nerve, to find enjoyment in something that they declare not canon. not deserving of any praise or attention, not worthwhile, not valuable, not important. These people have the chutzpah to lie and say that these are the games that ruin the Metroid series. Please. Right now is a great time to pick up these games. If you have a working GameCube and can find the first 2 games at your local old nerd shit store, which almost every town seems to have at least one of somewhere, pick them up. If you have a Wii or Wii U though, I recommend downloading the Trilogy collection off the eShop for $20, assuming you don't find the disc version cheaper at GameStop or something, which I still do on occasion. You get these 3 giant games for less than $7 each. That is such a steal. I get it that these games aren't for everybody, but they do have a place in the history of the Metroid series and should be appreciated for everything they did so right, and what they contributed to the Metroid universe. Personal taste be damned. I will always love these games, regardless of what the naysayers think. Every time I see some YouTube comments saying, "Please, make the next Metroid a real one and not another cheap FPS," I get this sickly chill, like, ew, stop it, please. The fact that these games have come under such fire for the most trivial shit or been dismissed altogether as the Metroid series remains on life support to this day is the only gaming injustice to be found here, and I hope I've been able to shed a little extra light on their greatness. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Metroid Prime series, and I didn't eat up nearly as much of your time defending the legitimacy of games I like as I have in other cases recently. Next up, we take a look at a Metroidvania unlike any other, so join me next month as we dive into Aquaria.